For some women, taking control means taking lives.
He's going to regret this. You're not going to get custody.
A mom wants custody of her child.
What did you say?
At any cost.
Big problem. He unleashed a monster.
Stop it!
An obsessed neighbor fans the flames of jealousy.
She was clearly a ticking time bomb.
And with this mom, the cost of lodging is death.
She got a thrill out of making people do things for her.
These women. Early, a tiny farming community in Iowa. A quiet, peaceful town. Then on December 13th, 2001, 35-year-old Tracy Richter has just put her 11-year-old son, Bert, to bed when she is the victim of a violent home invasion.
The big guy was dragging her around with pantyhose, slid her down the hallway.
Shut that kid up!
She overheard the little guy telling Bert behind the door, you know, shut up or you're next. And then the motherly instincts kicked in.
A mother's love gives Tracy the courage to fight back.
She was able to hop from the bed, unlock the gun safe, turn around.
She's got guns!
Fire. With precision, shot this intruder.
The big guy takes off running, and she can hear him bounding down the stairs and opening the front door.
Mrs. Richter, you must have been scared. Was it hard to think under pressure?
You know, I just went into autopilot.
Tracy's sharpshooting feat
And how many shots exactly?
makes her an instant media sensation.
I believe it was 11, and 9 of which hit their mark.
She's like a local hero. You know, she's like a poster child for the NRA.
That's some pretty sharp shooting.
She was viewed as Wonder Woman.
And how did you get the mark on your neck?
Oh, this is when they tried to strangle me with the pantyhose.
There was no doubts or questions in anyone's mind that what she did was wrong.
Nick, jump in and get closer.
This modern-day Annie Oakley enjoys the attention.
She put a spotlight on herself because of the things that she said and the things that she did.
But Tracy's not telling her whole story. 13 years.
Going from one step to the next, up that ladder of life. It's gonna be perfect.
The arrival of a son 2 years later completes the perfect picture.
You get that expression when you sleep, too.
After their son was born, it seemed to outsiders that their marriage was flourishing.
But like many women, Tracy struggles with the demands of being a new mom.
Why don't you stay and help?
And John's long days at work add to her stress.
What time will you be home? Midnight?
5.
John's training to be a surgeon kept him out of the house about 120 hours a week.
Being home alone with a baby isn't Tracy's idea of fun. She soon finds a way to keep herself amused.
Boy, am I glad to see you.
You look at Tracy, and it's like she always wants something more. Happiness is not enough. A child is not enough. So I gotta what? I gotta up the ante again, and I gotta start an affair.
Tracy thinks it's her dirty little secret. But John is no fool.
He started suspecting Tracy was seeing other men.
Can I help you?
Yeah, hi, I'm...
He hires a private investigator.
It's to check on my wife.
But nothing could prepare John for the report.
Not only did that investigator have his suspicions about Tracy? He told John the best thing he could do was to get out of that marriage, that he was in danger.
By 1992, the Pittmans' marriage is as rocky as the Colorado mountains.
My patient needed me.
You always have some excuse.
You really think I want to work these hours? I have no choice.
They got into an argument, and he decided to leave the house.
I have to go.
Oh, no, you don't.
Tracy absolutely lost it. Pulled out a gun, pointed it at him.
So what sort of wife, John is asking himself, would threaten her husband with a gun in the middle of a domestic argument? There's something within Tracy that John is about to learn that is very dark.
It's the last straw for John. He files for divorce.
What do you want?
But no one dumps Tracy.
Yeah, can you please sign the documents?
She goes right for the jugular. You know what? Nobody rejects me. I'm gonna get back at you. Big time.
Tracy files for sole custody of her son.
What did you say?
You heard me.
All she wanted to do was hurt John because he wanted to leave her.
But the divorce judge rules they must share custody. With her marriage woes behind her, Tracy moves on to her second husband, Australian Michael Roberts. The couple moves to Early, Iowa.
By all accounts, the first few years of the marriage between Tracy and Michael seemed to be very happy.
Having a second husband doesn't lessen Tracy's anger towards her first. She keeps using her son to hurt John.
Tracy would deny Dr. Pittman visitation.
So John does something that any father would do. He goes after his son.
He's going for sole custody.
He attempted to get sole custody. Big problem. He unleashed a monster.
He's going to regret this.
In Early, Iowa, Tracy Richter has a new husband, but she's still in a bitter custody battle for her son with her ex, Dr. John Pittman. Then, on December 13th, 2001, Tracy's the victim of a shocking crime. A home invasion.
She's got guns!
She manages to fight back and kills one of the intruders. It turns out to be her 20-year-old neighbor, Dustin Weedy.
People just thought was a strange kid to begin with. People kind of wanted to accept the fact that maybe he was capable of that.
Why would Dustin want to hurt Tracy? According to his confession, found in a pink spiral notebook, Tracy's ex-husband hired him.
And the spiral notebook basically detailed that John Pittman had been in contact with him and wanted him to kill Tracy.
But John denies ever meeting Dustin. And police can't find any phone records connecting the two.
You know, I just went into auto.
As police continue their investigation, Tracy enjoys her hero status. But Special Agent Trent Valletta thinks something's up.
The marks on her neck looked red, but I kept asking myself, if you are getting pulled down the hallway, why isn't there more bruising?
And who's heard of a killer leaving a confession lying around?
Something doesn't smell right. In fact, something smells evil here.
But suspicions can't get a conviction. Without enough evidence, the case goes cold. But Agent Valletta can't forget it.
He was already obsessed, and I became obsessed.
In 2009, 8 years after the murder, Sac County District Attorney Ben Smith reopens the investigation. And Tracy's true colors are exposed.
What they find, they claim, is the most violent, most vile snuff pornography they've ever seen in their careers. This stuff is brutal.
30-plus videos of men breaking into a house and raping a single woman. There were dozens of pictures of dead bodies.
There wasn't anything Tracy didn't like to do. It all gave her a thrill.
When they re-interview a friend of Tracy's, she reveals information for the first time that breaks the case.
Tracy told her about a notebook just days after it happened.
Police never released the fact that they found the notebook confession.
What they did, which I thought was genius, was they told nobody about the pink notebook. So in their minds, they thought that whoever started talking about the pink notebook first would be the one that was guilty of the crime.
That's the case right there. She should have known about a notebook, right?
Tracy isn't a victim. She's a cold-blooded assassin.
Hey, Dustin.
Hi, Tracy.
Her kind-hearted neighbor didn't suspect a thing.
He was just more of a quiet kid, quiet, lonely kid that didn't have any friends.
Hey, could I borrow your muscles for a minute?
Yeah, sure.
Kind of a goofy-looking kid, but I think had a good heart.
Dustin often helps Tracy around the house. Today,
Come in.
she wants a lot more from him.
It would be extremely easy for a woman like Tracy to manipulate a guy like Dustin.
Take a seat.
What's going on?
Sit down.
She pulls out one of her guns and she says, "You're gonna write something down on a piece of paper, and you're gonna do it right now."
Write this down.
She forces Dustin to write a confession that implicates her ex-husband.
This was all about framing her ex-husband to get custody of Bert.
Faster, write it down.
She can take that notebook to court. She can show that she was assaulted, and there's no one to say that it didn't happen because Dustin's dead.
Stand up. Turn around.
Please don't hurt me.
I'm not gonna hurt you, Dustin. I'm gonna kill you.
Tracy takes a life of an innocent young man to win a custody battle.
She fires, and she hits him 9 out of 11 times.
She plotted, she planned, she pulled the trigger.
Tracy then plants the damning notebook in Dustin's car and turns herself into the victim.
It's a calculated thing. She didn't really have any other bruises on her body, so she had to produce some sort of evidence that Dustin was there and Dustin actually assaulted her.
As outlandish as Tracy's plan was, she pulled it off for 10 years.
Finally, Tracy gets a knock on the door
Yes?
and is arrested. In 2011, The jury takes less than 2 hours to find her guilty of first-degree murder.
She was willing to kill somebody, basically to win a custody dispute.
Tracy Richter is sentenced to life in prison without parole.
Psychopaths look at themselves as being smarter than everyone around them. They pride themselves on their ability to lie and get away with it. But Tracy wasn't that good of a psychopath.
Fire transforms a home into a death trap.
They were all going to die, and there was nothing he could do about it.
Shock turns to disbelief.
She had no sense of control. She had no boundaries.
This blaze is no accident.
She was clearly a ticking time bomb. Together, as a family.
Leanna is a stay-at-home mom, while Liam works 2 jobs to give 15-month-old Charlie the best they can.
They were just starting out in life, really, together.
He's finally asleep.
Oh, is he now?
The young couple rent an upstairs apartment, and they couldn't be happier. The same can't be said for their downstairs neighbor.
Stop it!
43-year-old Melanie Smith.
Shut up! Don't make me come up there!
God. We've awakened the beast.
She scares me.
Don't worry about it. Just ignore it.
Stop it!
Melanie had lots of mental and emotional problems. She treated them with alcohol. That made everything worse.
You were you last night till 12 o'clock?
I was with Charlie.
With Charlie, were you?
Melanie Smith appeared to be a lonely person. She appeared to have alienated anyone who ever got close to her.
Melanie doesn't even trust her live-in lover, 45-year-old Steve Clarkson.
Melanie had accused Steve of having an affair, on many of occasions.
What are you looking at?
Nothing.
I know what you're up to.
Melanie thought any woman she saw was having an affair with her boyfriend,
including her much younger neighbor, Leanna.
With that slag upstairs!
What? You're off your bloody rocker. What?
That wasn't happening. But once Melanie got a hold of an idea, she never let it go.
Melanie becomes obsessed with Leanna and everything she does.
She looked for things to be angry about.
Hello?
If she couldn't find anything, she'd go looking for it.
Stupid bloody thing. Are you right?
Melanie was angered by Leanna leaving the pram in the stairwell. There was also a dispute over Leanna leaving cigarette butts outside the front of the house.
What is her problem?
Life.
She didn't hold back when it came to being aggressive in the situation.
I'll burn the bloody house down with her and the kitchenette!
For Liam and Leanna, their crazy neighbor is annoying, but surely not dangerous.
I think that they just looked at her as a drunk, just talking rubbish.
But paranoia, obsession, and alcohol are a dangerous mix.
I know what you're up to in there. I'll burn the bloody house down with you and the kitchenette.
She should have been taken more seriously.
In the Welsh seaside town of Prestatyn, there is no love lost between the upstairs and the downstairs neighbors.
Stop it!
Melanie Smith is at war with young couple Liam Timbrell and Leanna Shires.
Hello?
Everything Leanna and Liam did upset Melanie. But I think anyone who had lived there would have upset Melanie.
I'll burn the bloody house down with his head and the kitchenette!
Melanie is particularly angry at Leanna.
She was jealous. She thought Leanna was having an affair with her boyfriend.
There is no affair, but Melanie's vivid imagination is fueled by alcohol. October 19th, 2012. She hits the bottle early.
Melanie appeared to have been drinking all day.
Don't you dare!
She was clearly a ticking time bomb.
Upstairs,
Little circles, come on.
Liam and Leanna have a full house.
There we go.
15-month-old Charlie has playmates.
Can you see yourself in the mirror?
2 young cousins are having a sleepover.
Leanna's niece and nephew, Bailey, who was 4, and Sky, who was 2, they were staying with her for the evening.
Okay, kidlets, time to spit in the sink. Are you ready? And spit.
Fun and laughter. But not for Melanie.
She was at boiling point.
Oh, perfect.
I'm gonna do it!
What are you doing? It doesn't go that way.
Don't make me do it!
Off we go.
She set the pram on fire at the bottom of the stairwell.
Burn in hell!
She had no sense of control. She had no boundaries. She decided to set the fire and let what happened, happen.
Fire breaks out in the communal hallway.
The fire was set in the only escape route for the upstairs apartment.
Liam knows the only way his family can get out is down the stairs. But the heat and flames push him back.
Fire! Fire!
After the fire had caught on and the carpet and walls were burning, it would be impossible for the family upstairs to get out.
Everything's okay.
And the windows can't be opened.
All right, we're gonna go back. We're gonna change of plan.
There wasn't even a chance of escape. Unbeknownst to them, they were living in a death trap.
Liam makes a desperate call to emergency services.
Help us! Help! Someone's at the flat on fire!
It must have been horrendous for Liam and Leanna with the 3 children because there was absolutely no way out.
There's a fire downstairs.
Liam knew after the fire was set that they were all going to die, and there was nothing he could do about it. He also knew help was not going to get to them in time.
Firefighters arrive, but it's too late for Leanna, 4-year-old Bailey, and 2-year-old Sky. Somehow, Charlie and Liam survive, just.
In incredible pain. His lungs and airways would have been burning with each breath.
But he fights the pain to say a few words.
It was arson.
He made a dying declaration. He told the firefighters who did it.
It was Mel.
I suspect that those words were the last he ever spoke.
Living downstairs, Melanie escapes the flames through a window.
As the fire broke out, Melanie and Steve escaped through the bedroom window.
Melanie Smith, is it?
Aye, that's me.
What do you know about what's happened tonight?
I was in bed. I had nothing to do with that.
In bed, were you?
Yeah, I was in bed with Steve here.
Melanie Smith painted a picture of almost being a victim herself.
Tell them I was in bed with you, wasn't I?
I see.
Tell the officer I was in bed with you.
Save it for the station.
Soon police learn of Melanie's grudge against Leanna.
I burn the bloody house down with you and the kids in it.
And more telling, her heartless reaction to the plight of the family.
Are the children up there?
When a resident asked Melanie, how many children are up there.
How many were up there? How the bloody hell would I know? She's got everybody up there.
She said this while Leanna, Liam, and 3 little children were burning to death.
But Liam's dying courage decides Melanie's future. She is arrested and charged with 3 counts of murder. A tally that soon rises.
Charlie, the baby, mercifully died in 2 days. Liam lingered for 3 horrible weeks. And before he died, he knew what had happened to his entire family. And he knew who did it. They'll get no argument from me.
Sometimes it's not wrong place, wrong time.
They kicked her, they stomped on her, they beat her on the head.
It's wrong place.
She got a thrill out of making people do things for her.
Wrong people.
Rhonda demanded absolute loyalty, and she got it.
2010, Nipomo, California. Seemingly a quiet rural community.
You wouldn't have to blink more than twice going through it, but it's nice enough.
But it has a dark underbelly.
Stop using and start bagging.
47-year-old Rhonda Wisto's home is the center of a drug ring.
She had been hooked on meth most of her adult life. Her home became this sort of meth distribution center.
She would allow people to hole up at her house as long as they did things for her.
That's why she called herself the Puppet Master.
Rhonda sort of began to fancy herself as this Ma Barker type, this middle-aged mother who was a gang leader.
It's a simple transaction. Drugs for loyalty. Rhonda even uses the same method to control her son, 19-year-old Jacob York.
Did you weigh this?
He wasn't a very outgoing person. His demeanor was sort of quiet.
He says he can feel the weight.
Use the scales.
Rhonda demanded absolute loyalty from her family and those close to her in the gang. And she got it.
But a small-time operation isn't enough for Rhonda. She wants to be a drug kingpin.
It's not that hard.
So she recruits a lieutenant, 28-year-old Ty Hill.
Ty Hill was the one assisting Rhonda in amping up the criminal enterprise. And then they were trying to move up into the larger quantities, ounces, half pounds, that kind of stuff.
He told people he was a bail bondsman. He carried handcuffs. He also had a sadistic side.
Across town, life couldn't be more different for 15-year-old Destiny Myers.
She was a Girl Scout. She sang in her church choir.
Many people saw promise in Destiny. Teachers thought she was very bright. For a while, it looked like she had everything going for her.
Voice of an angel.
Just beautiful.
Destiny was raised by her grandmother because her mother had drug issues herself, and she was young and out of jail.
You know what? I would like Destiny to lead our choir program.
But Destiny doesn't stay a good girl. she's drawn to the wild side, like her mother.
You're going to school today. Make me.
Some children who have parents in prison act real bad or are real bad because they think it's their destiny, their DNA destiny.
In September 2010, Destiny runs away from home. One of the first people she hooks up with
Did she say anything about me?
is Ty Hill.
No.
He offers her a place to stay.
I got a place to stay. We have weed there.
Yeah.
She doesn't realize what she's walking into.
Ty Michael Hill brought her to Rhonda's.
Boys, this is Destiny. Destiny, this is the boys.
And initially passed her off as his niece.
And this is Rhonda. Rhonda, this is my niece. Can she stay?
In Rhonda's world, you live by her rules. Or face the consequences.
Rhonda really got into the whole gang culture.
Mind your own business and don't ask questions.
And in the gang world, respect meant everything.
And keep your mouth shut.
Aye, aye, Captain.
For a newly minted bad girl, rules are for losers.
Destiny, get in here.
And at one point, she had carved a symbol into a piece of furniture that Rhonda owned.
You don't have to yell. How dare you vandalize my table?
It's not exactly an antique.
You watch yourself, girl.
Here you have this young, slight, 15-year-old girl standing up to her, talking back to her.
Just shut your mouth or you regret it.
I think that really offended her and threatened her status as the leader of the gang.
Destiny's mouth isn't the only thing getting her into trouble.
Destiny became the girlfriend of Rhonda's son. Big mistake.
Rhonda worried that if word got out that her son was sleeping with a 15-year-old, that he would get in trouble. She was also very worried that Destiny was going to tip off police as to some of the illegal activity that had been taking place at the house.
Destiny knew too much about Rhonda's criminal enterprise.
Rhonda decides Destiny must go. September 26th, 2010. Napomo, California. 47-year-old puppet master Rhonda Wistow gives orders to her crew.
I don't think she's gonna be a problem.
Oh, she is gonna be a problem. That mouth of hers is gonna get us all in trouble.
So what would you like us to do?
What do you think?
Together they plan 15-year-old Destiny Myers' farewell.
Some of the items on the list were 55-gallon drum, shovels, a tent, flammable fluids. Once they had the list, then they just had to wait for the right time.
Destiny senses something is wrong and thinks it's time to go.
She was carrying a bag of clothes.
You're not going nowhere.
Ty Hill injected her with a pretty heavy dose of meth.
But not a dose that will kill her. Rhonda wants Destiny to suffer.
Mom, I don't want to do this.
Rhonda's son did not want to be involved in the murder of Destiny. And Rhonda said,
Sometimes things just need to happen. Get in there.
And he did what Mama wanted.
And I think that she actually got a thrill out of making people do things for her. They used their fists, Her feet, brass knuckles, a sword, and a baseball bat.
What's that? Hey, get up! Get up! Get in there!
Rhonda orders 20-year-olds, Jason Greenwell and Cody Miller, to join in.
Destiny was petite, probably 100 pounds. 4 young males could have killed her very quickly and, well, frankly, painlessly. But they didn't. They kicked her to death, they stomped on her, they beat her on the head. Completely unnecessary.
But it's necessary for Rhonda. She can hold this murder over her boys forever. But not all of them. One of Rhonda's henchmen, Cody Miller, is next on her hit list.
Rhonda ordered her son and the others, after they were done killing Destiny, to kill Cody. She thought he was a police informant. He wasn't.
He was knocked out and actually fell into the pit that he just dumped Destiny's body into.
Against the odds, Cody escapes.
Jacob takes off running after him. Neither of them have a flashlight. So Cody doesn't have to go very far, and he hides.
Jacob gives up the chase.
He's dead. You sure? He's gotta be.
So the body's in the grave. They throw some kindling on top of it, put the flammable liquid on there, ignite it. There's a boom, a loud noise, and that wakes up the neighbors.
Rhonda's henchmen weren't exactly the brightest lights in the harbor.
When firefighters arrive, they find more than a grass fire.
A man came out of the darkness. He didn't have a shirt on, his face was covered in blood, and his nose was almost amputated. He said that there had been a murder committed, and he told the firefighters the blaze they were about to fight would contain the victim.
Rhonda's plan backfires. Now, Cody is a police informant. He names names. Rhonda, Jacob, Jason, and Ty are arrested. Ty Hill and Cody Miller plead guilty to first-degree murder and are sentenced to life without parole. Jason Greenwell, guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 15 years to life.
Murder was not in the cards for these defendants until they met Rhonda Wistow.
In May 2013, mother and son are found guilty of first-degree murder.
He may not have had the heart for murder that his mother did, and he may not have wanted to kill Destiny, but he did.
They receive the same sentence, life without parole. Rhonda Wistow's need to control puts 4 young men behind bars and takes a life that had hardly even begun.
A lot of people said that Destiny did lose her way, but some people felt eventually she would have gotten back on track. Maybe the fact that she was leaving that house, that could have been the first step, but we'll never know.
These deadly women wanted the ultimate control, sentencing others to death. Tracy Richter took an innocent life to frame her ex. Melanie Smith condemned a family to flames. And Rhonda Wistow proved her dominance with murder. Lives meant nothing to them. Their hearts weren't just hard. They were cold as ice.
The house was quiet when they opened the door. Too quiet for a place that had once held laughter, arguments, slammed doors. The ordinary noise of a family alive and breathing, and the quiet wasn't new. It had been sitting there for decades, thick as dust, pressed into the walls, into the floorboards, into the narrow hallway where a woman disappeared without a sound and without a trace. And the question that still hangs in the air is the same one whispered in Illinois for more than 30 years. How does someone vanish from their own life and leave nothing behind but fear? It began on a night that should have been forgettable, a weekday evening in a small Illinois town where nothing dramatic was supposed to happen, where people locked their doors out of habit rather than necessity, where neighbors recognized each other's cars by the sound of the engine, and where the idea of a violent crime felt distant, abstract, something that happened somewhere else, to other people, until it didn't. The woman was last seen inside her home, a modest place with beige siding and a yard that never quite stayed trimmed, the kind of house that blends into a block so completely you could drive past it 100 times and never remember the number. And that was the problem, because when she was gone, no one could point to a moment where everything changed. There was no scream, no forced entry, no broken window glittering on the lawn, no blood soaking into the carpet, just an empty bedroom, a purse left behind, keys still hanging where she always put them, and a silence that made no sense. Police arrived thinking it would be quick, a misunderstanding, a domestic dispute. Maybe she left on her own and would be back by morning, but hours turned into days and days into weeks, and the story hardened into something colder, heavier, a missing persons report that refused to resolve itself. The community reacted the way small towns always do, with shock that turns into suspicion, with casseroles dropped off at the house and whispered conversations at the grocery store, with the same questions asked again and again until they lost their meaning. Who would want to hurt her? Why would she leave without telling anyone? What happened inside that house after the lights went out? The police worked the case hard at first, canvassing neighbors, retracing routines, mapping out her last known movements like a grid that might reveal a hidden shape if you stared at it long enough. But every lead ended the same way, with a door closed, a memory too vague, a timeline that refused to line up. Her family became the center of the storm, whether they wanted it or not, their faces suddenly familiar to strangers, their words dissected, their grief measured and judged, and inside the house the tension grew unbearable. Detectives asked the same questions over and over, looking for cracks, inconsistencies, anything that might explain how a woman could disappear from her own bed and never come home, and each interview left behind more uncertainty instead of answers. Friends described her as dependable, routine-driven, someone who didn't just vanish, and that detail clung to the investigation like a warning sign flashing red. As weeks turned into months, the case cooled in the way investigators dread, not all at once but slowly, quietly, like a fire starved of oxygen. Tips dried up. Search efforts scaled back. The headlines shrank from bold black letters to short updates buried deep in the paper, and then, eventually, nothing at all. The file was pushed back, labeled unresolved, a cold case in everything but name, and the town learned how to live with an absence that never explained itself. Years passed, and with them came new families, new stories, new tragedies that pushed the old ones further into the background, but the disappearance never fully let go. It lingered in conversations, in late-night radio shows, in the memories of the detectives who worked it and couldn't forget the feeling that something obvious had been missed. Every so often, a rumor surfaced, a supposed sighting, a claim that someone knew something, but each one collapsed under scrutiny, leaving the case exactly where it had always been, frozen in time. Inside the family, the damage was permanent. Relationships frayed under the weight of unanswered questions. Silence replaced conversations that used to flow easily. Holidays became reminders instead of celebrations, and the unspoken truth was that everyone had their own version of what happened, their own quiet theory that they never said out loud because saying it would make it real. The house itself became a symbol, standing there year after year, unchanged, like a monument to a moment that never ended. Detectives came and went, the original investigators retiring, their notes boxed up, their memories fading, until the case existed mostly on paper, a thick folder stamped with dates that felt like another lifetime. And then, decades later, something shifted. Not a dramatic confession, not a body discovered in a shallow grave, but a detail, small and unsettling, buried deep in the original reports, something that had been overlooked because it didn't fit the narrative everyone expected at the time. A reopened cold case doesn't announce itself loudly. It begins with quiet phone calls, with a detective pulling a file from a shelf and feeling the weight of it in their hands, with a sense that the story everyone accepted might not be the story at all. Advances in forensic methods played a role, but so did distance, the ability to look back without the pressure and chaos of the original search, to question assumptions that once felt untouchable. The family was contacted again, voices on the phone tense, guarded, as the past came rushing back without warning. Old statements were revisited, timelines reconstructed, words spoken decades earlier examined with new intensity, and the effect was immediate. Long-buried tensions resurfaced. Old arguments were dragged into the light. The careful balance everyone had built to survive was suddenly at risk of collapse. What investigators began to see was not a random act of violence, not a stranger passing through town, but a pattern of silence, a series of decisions made inside the home that night and in the days that followed. The absence of chaos was no longer reassuring. It was suspicious. The lack of evidence didn't mean nothing happened. It meant someone had made sure of it. As the investigation gained momentum, the town felt it too, the old story returning to headlines, this time with a sharper edge. A cold case reopened. New questions. Old faces back in the spotlight. People who thought the past was safely buried suddenly realized it wasn't done with them yet. Every interview, every document, every faded photograph became a potential trigger, a reminder that time doesn't erase guilt, it only hides it. The phrase family secret began to circulate, first as speculation, then as something closer to fact, and with it came a sense of unease that spread far beyond the people directly involved. Because if the truth had been inside that house all along, if the disappearance wasn't the work of a monster from the outside but the result of something closer, something more intimate, then everyone had been standing next to it for years without knowing. Investigators moved carefully, aware that reopening wounds could have consequences, but also aware that this might be the last chance. Memories fade. People die. And some secrets only surface when the pressure becomes impossible to ignore. The cold case was no longer cold in the way people think of that word. It was active, volatile, threatening to explode after decades of silence. And still, no body. No crime scene in the traditional sense. Just a trail of inconsistencies, of behaviors that didn't line up, of decisions that only made sense if you assumed the unthinkable. The house was searched again, not because anyone expected to find something new, but because sometimes returning to the beginning is the only way forward, and standing in those rooms, listening to the echo of footsteps on old floors, investigators felt it again, that same unease. The sense that the walls had witnessed something they were never meant to hold. By the time the first arrest warrants were quietly discussed, the story had already changed forever. This was no longer just a missing person. It was a reckoning, a confrontation with a past that refused to stay buried. And as the cold case edged closer to what authorities would later call closure, the realization settled in, heavy and unavoidable, that whatever happened in that house all those years ago had never really ended. It had simply been waiting, patient and silent, for the moment when the truth could no longer hide. The first knock on the door came early in the morning, the kind of hour when people are still half asleep and the world feels unfinished. And when the family opened it, they were greeted not by uniforms or flashing lights, but by familiar faces, detectives older now, slower in their movements, carrying the weight of a case that had followed them for half a lifetime. There was no announcement, no dramatic declaration, just a quiet request to talk, And in that moment, the past rushed back into the room, thick and suffocating, because everyone knew what that knock meant, even if no one said it out loud. They began where they always do, with timelines, with routines, with questions that sound simple until you try to answer them honestly. What time did she go to bed? Who was the last person to see her? Did anything feel off that night? The answers came cautiously, polished by repetition, delivered in the same phrasing that had been used decades earlier, but now the detectives weren't listening for the words, they were listening for the pauses between them, for the moments where memory hesitated, where certainty slipped. Time has a way of softening details, but it also has a way of revealing which details were never solid to begin with. In the original investigation, one detail had been written off as insignificant, almost mundane. A late-night errand. A brief absence. A claim that someone had stepped out while others slept. Back then, it was accepted without much thought, a normal explanation in a normal house. Now, with distance and context, it felt wrong. The timing didn't add up. The route didn't make sense. And most importantly, no one outside the family could confirm it. Neighbors were re-interviewed, some surprised, some visibly uncomfortable, forced to reopen memories they had neatly sealed away. A woman remembered hearing a car engine late that night, idling longer than usual. A man recalled seeing a vehicle parked at an odd angle near the house, something he had dismissed at the time as nothing worth mentioning. These weren't explosive revelations, but cold cases rarely move that way. They advance inch by inch, on details so small they feel meaningless until they're stacked together and suddenly form a shape no one wants to recognize. The investigators returned to the physical space, not because they expected forensic miracles, but because places remember things people try to forget. The house had been renovated, repainted, updated to keep up with the years, but the layout was the same: the narrow hallways, the cramped bedrooms, the basement that felt colder than the rest of the house no matter the season. Standing there, the detectives talked quietly, imagining movement, imagining sound, imagining a sequence of events that could explain the impossible calm of the original scene. What struck them most was what wasn't there. No signs of a struggle, no mess, no evidence of panic. To some, that meant nothing violent had occurred. To seasoned investigators, it suggested control, familiarity. The kind of situation where someone doesn't need to scream because they trust the person standing in front of them, at least at first. That realization reframed everything. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. This wasn't chaos. It was contained, deliberate, and personal. Financial records were pulled, old bank statements reviewed with modern software, patterns emerging where once there had only been noise. Small withdrawals. Transfers that coincided uncomfortably with the timeline of the disappearance. Nothing illegal on its own, nothing dramatic enough to trigger alarms back then, but together they suggested preparation, not reaction. The idea that the disappearance was planned, at least in part, settled heavily over the investigation, changing its tone from tragic mystery to something darker. The family dynamics came under scrutiny in a way they never had before. Old arguments surfaced in interviews, disputes that had been minimized or denied entirely during the initial search. Friends recalled tension in the months leading up to that night, moments that felt insignificant at the time, but now carried a sharper edge. There were stories of control, of resentment, of pressure building quietly behind closed doors. None of it proved anything on its own, but it painted a picture that was increasingly hard to ignore. As word spread that the case was active again, the town reacted with a mix of curiosity and dread. People who had grown up hearing about the disappearance now watched it unfold in real time, their childhood ghost suddenly alive again in headlines and conversations. Social media amplified everything, speculation running wild, names thrown around without restraint, and for the family, the scrutiny was relentless. Every appearance, every statement, every moment of silence was dissected, analyzed, judged. Investigators worked deliberately, knowing that rushing now could destroy years of careful reconstruction. They consulted behavioral experts, not to profile a stranger, but to understand a household, to interpret decisions made under stress, to see how fear and loyalty can twist actions into something unrecognizable. One conclusion became unavoidable. If the truth was going to surface, it would come not from a single dramatic piece of evidence, but from the accumulation of inconsistencies that could no longer be explained away. One by one, family members were interviewed separately, then together, their stories compared, aligned, then tested under pressure. Minor differences emerged at first, harmless enough to dismiss, but as sessions continued, those differences grew sharper. Timelines shifted.
Details changed.
What had once been a shared narrative began to fracture, and the fractures were revealing. People remember trauma differently, but they don't usually remember invented stories the same way twice. The most unsettling moment came during a routine review of evidence photographs from the original investigation. An object, barely visible in the background of one image, caught a detective's attention. It had been there all along, overlooked because no one knew to look for it. Now, with fresh eyes, it felt out of place. Its position contradicted a key statement given years earlier. When questioned about it, the response was delayed, defensive, and ultimately unconvincing. That was the moment the investigation shifted from possibility to probability. The missing woman was no longer just gone. She had been erased. And the erasure required access, knowledge, and time. The idea of an outsider faded completely, replaced by a far more disturbing scenario, one that suggested the truth had been sitting in plain sight, protected not by complexity, but by trust. Search warrants followed, quiet and precise, executed without spectacle. Items were seized that most people would consider meaningless: old tools, containers, records kept for reasons no one could fully explain. Forensic testing was ordered, not because anyone expected a miracle, but because cold cases demand persistence, and sometimes persistence is enough. The waiting began again, tense and familiar, as results crawled back piece by piece. Inside the family, the pressure was unbearable. Conversations became confrontations. Accusations hung in the air without being spoken. The past, once buried under years of forced normalcy, was now an open wound. Some members cooperated fully, desperate for resolution. Others retreated, lawyers appearing, statements shortened, silence replacing what little openness remained. To investigators, that shift spoke volumes. The town watched as unmarked cars appeared on quiet streets, as reporters returned to doorsteps they hadn't visited in decades. The phrase "cold case" took on a new meaning, no longer a symbol of failure, but of delayed truth. And with every passing day, the sense grew that the story everyone thought they knew was about to be rewritten, not by a stranger's confession or a chance discovery, but by the slow collapse of a family secret that had been held together by fear and time. By the end of that phase of the investigation, one thing was clear. Whatever happened that night had not been an accident, and it had not been forgotten. It had been managed, contained, and hidden, layer by layer, year after year. And as the evidence mounted and the silence deepened, the case moved closer to a point of no return, where the only thing left to decide was who would break first, and how much damage the truth would cause when it finally did. The lab results didn't arrive all at once. They never do. They came in fragments, emails and phone calls spaced days apart, each one adding weight to a case that was already bending under the strain, and with every update the story narrowed. The margins shrinking until there was less room to hide than anyone inside that family had expected. Trace evidence that once meant nothing now carried implications, not definitive proof, but enough to redraw timelines and challenge statements that had been treated as fact for decades. One test confirmed the presence of material that shouldn't have been where it was found, not enough to tell a complete story, but enough to say this much with certainty: the house had not been as untouched as everyone believed. Cleaning products were identified in concentrations that didn't match normal use, suggesting not routine housekeeping, but effort, intention, a need to remove something specific. The absence of visible blood had once reassured investigators. Now it felt like a deliberate achievement. As the forensic picture sharpened, investigators turned their attention to the days immediately following the disappearance, a period that had received surprisingly little scrutiny at the time. Back then, the focus had been on finding her, on searching fields and rivers and abandoned buildings, not on watching the people left behind. Now, every action taken in those first 72 hours was re-examined. Who made phone calls? Who didn't? Who left town briefly, and why? Who seemed too calm, too organized, too focused on logistics when chaos would have been the expected response. One detail stood out. A trip that had been described as routine, necessary, almost forgettable. A drive taken alone late at night, explained away as stress or the need for air. Receipts placed the vehicle miles from where it was supposed to be. Gas station cameras, grainy and incomplete, captured a familiar silhouette at an hour that contradicted sworn statements. The footage wasn't clear enough to stand alone in court, but it didn't need to. It only needed to crack the surface. Confronted with the discrepancy, the explanation shifted. Memory failure, confusion, time distortion under stress. Investigators nodded, let the words settle, then returned to them days later, asking the same questions in a different order, watching how the story bent under repetition. Each retelling introduced new elements, small adjustments meant to patch earlier gaps, but the patches didn't hold. The shape of the lie, if it was a lie, became easier to see the more it was handled. Outside the interview rooms, the community was reaching its own conclusions. The narrative had changed, and with it, the tone. This was no longer a tragic mystery about a woman lost to the unknown. This was about accountability, about whether justice could still matter after so much time had passed. People who had once defended the family now avoided speaking publicly. Others, emboldened by the reopening of the case, came forward with memories they had dismissed or suppressed, details that felt dangerous to share years ago but now seemed necessary. One neighbor described an argument overheard weeks before the disappearance, voices raised late at night, words indistinct but anger unmistakable. Another recalled seeing trash bags being moved unusually early in the morning, heavier than they should have been, placed carefully into a vehicle rather than set out for collection. At the time, these observations meant nothing. Now, they formed a pattern of behavior that felt purposeful, rehearsed. Investigators mapped out a new theory, not as a single event, but as a sequence. Tension escalating, a confrontation, a decision made in a moment that could not be undone. What followed wasn't panic, but control, the kind that comes from familiarity with the environment and confidence that no one would question actions taken inside one's own home. The theory didn't require extraordinary strength or planning, only opportunity and the belief that silence would protect everyone involved. That belief had held for decades, but it was beginning to fracture. The pressure of renewed attention exposed fault lines within the family that time had never fully healed. Interviews became shorter, more defensive. Cooperation slowed. Lawyers intervened. Investigators recognized the signs immediately. People who have nothing to hide don't suddenly stop talking when questions get closer to the truth. Financial analysis added another layer. Property records revealed changes made to the house shortly after the disappearance, renovations justified as maintenance, but suspicious in their timing and scope. A basement floor replaced. Soil removed from the property. Work done quietly, without permits, explained away later as convenience or cost-saving. Individually, each decision was plausible. Together, they suggested urgency. Search warrants expanded beyond the house. Vehicles once owned, then sold. Storage units rented briefly and closed. Rural land connected through distant relatives. Each location was examined with the same grim patience, understanding that even if nothing was found, the act of searching sent a message. The past was no longer off-limits. It was being excavated, piece by piece. The emotional toll on investigators was evident. Cold cases carry a unique weight, not just because of their age, but because of the lives lived in the meantime. Children had grown up. Parents had died. The missing woman existed now mostly in photographs and memories, frozen at the age she disappeared. Bringing the case back into the present felt like disturbing a grave, but the alternative, leaving it unresolved, felt worse. As the evidence stack grew, so did the internal debate. Was there enough to move forward? Enough to accuse? Enough to risk tearing apart what remained of a family? Prosecutors were consulted early, their questions blunt and unforgiving. Where is the body? What proves a crime occurred? How do you explain the absence? Investigators answered with what they had: patterns, inconsistencies, forensic indicators, and the undeniable reality that people do not simply vanish from stable lives without explanation. The phrase, "no body, no case," hovered over every discussion, a reminder of the risk. But times had changed. Jurors were more willing to consider circumstantial evidence. Cold cases across the country had shown that absence could speak volumes when paired with motive, opportunity, and behavior that defied logic. The challenge was weaving those elements into a narrative strong enough to survive scrutiny. Behind closed doors, family members began to turn on one another, not openly, but subtly. Hints dropped in interviews. Corrections offered that shifted blame. Statements framed to distance oneself from key moments. Loyalty eroded under pressure, replaced by self-preservation. Investigators watched it happen, careful not to push too hard, knowing that fractures widen on their own if you give them time. One interview, in particular, lingered in the minds of everyone involved. A question about that night, simple and direct, met with an answer that didn't just change the timeline, it contradicted a foundational assumption of the entire case. When asked to clarify, the subject froze, eyes darting, breath catching, before offering a correction that only made things worse. It was a human moment, unguarded, and it revealed more than hours of rehearsed statements ever could. From that point on, the investigation accelerated. The focus narrowed to a specific window of time, a specific sequence of actions, a specific group of people who had both motive and means. The missing woman's voice, absent for decades, seemed to echo through the process, not in words, but in the insistence of the facts aligning despite every attempt to keep them apart. The town felt the shift. This was no longer speculation. This was momentum. The possibility of arrests became real, discussed quietly in coffee shops and online forums, feared by some, hoped for by others. The case had reached a stage where it could no longer retreat into the shadows. Whatever the outcome, the truth was coming closer, and it was not going to be gentle. As investigators prepared their next moves, they knew the hardest part was still ahead. Accusations would have consequences. Families would be shattered. The community would have to confront the idea that the danger had not come from outside, but from within, hidden in plain sight. And as the cold case edged closer to a formal conclusion, one thing was clear. The silence that had protected the secret for so long was breaking, and once broken, it could never be repaired. The decision to move forward was not announced. It was felt, a subtle change in tone, a tightening of focus, the kind of shift that happens when an investigation crosses an invisible line, and there is no longer any doubt about what comes next. Meetings grew longer. Conversations became quieter. Every word spoken inside the task force room carried weight, because everyone understood that they were no longer chasing a mystery, they were preparing to accuse someone of erasing a life. Prosecutors demanded clarity, not emotion, not intuition, but a narrative that could survive daylight and cross-examination. Investigators laid it out piece by piece: the controlled scene, the financial anomalies, the inconsistent statements, the forensic indicators of cleaning and renovation, the late-night drives that didn't belong, the neighbors' memories sharpened by time. It wasn't a single smoking gun, but a pattern so tight it left little room for innocence. The argument was simple and devastating. The only people who could have done this were the ones who said nothing happened. Attention turned to the night itself, reconstructed minute by minute, not as it had been described, but as it must have occurred if all the evidence was telling the truth. The house quiet, the hour late, tension already present, unspoken but heavy. A conversation that escalated, words cutting deeper than intended, a moment when control slipped just long enough for something irreversible to occur. The theory did not rely on premeditated murder. It relied on panic and familiarity, on the terrible realization that an accident or confrontation had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. What followed was not chaos, but calculation. Someone checked the house. Someone cleaned. Someone made decisions while adrenaline still masked the weight of what had happened. The absence of evidence was no longer a mystery. It was the result of effort, of people working together or, at least, not working against one another. Silence became the strategy, reinforced over time by fear, by shared guilt, by the understanding that speaking would destroy more than it saved. Investigators revisited phone records with that theory in mind, seeing them now as a map of coordination rather than coincidence. Calls made and not made. Delays that suggested discussion. Messages that stopped abruptly. The timeline tightened, and within it, one figure emerged as central, present at every critical moment, connected to every key decision, the gravitational center around which the rest of the story revolved. Interviewing that person again required care. Too much pressure would shut them down completely. Too little would allow the rehearsed narrative to hold. The detectives chose patience, letting the conversation wander, revisiting old ground slowly, watching for fatigue, for the moment when the story began to unravel under its own weight. It happened not with a confession, but with a contradiction so fundamental it couldn't be explained away. A detail about where someone was standing. A claim about who spoke first. A description of a sound that shouldn't have been audible from that location. Small things, but they mattered because they revealed presence, awareness, involvement. When confronted gently, the response was defensive, then evasive, then angry. The shift was immediate and unmistakable. The mask had slipped. At the same time, pressure mounted elsewhere. Another family member, interviewed separately, began to show signs of strain. Their loyalty, once absolute, was cracking under the realization that they might be sacrificing their own future for someone else's secret. The interviews grew emotional. Tears appeared, followed by long silences. Questions were met with "I don't remember" and "I can't say," phrases that spoke louder than any accusation. Behind the scenes, investigators debated strategy. Was it better to push for charges now or wait, hoping someone would break? Every day increased the risk of leaks, of stories spinning out of control, of defense attorneys shaping narratives before the state could present its own. But waiting also carried danger. Memories fade. Resolve hardens. And sometimes the only way to force the truth into the open is to apply pressure that can't be ignored. The town felt it before anything became public. Unmarked vehicles parked longer than usual. Familiar faces seen entering government buildings. Rumors sharpened, speculation turning darker, more specific. The case that had once been a distant tragedy was now a living thing again, and it was making people uncomfortable. Because if the investigators were right, then the danger had never been hypothetical. It had lived quietly among them, protected by normalcy and time. Media attention intensified, reporters digging into archives, resurfacing old interviews, juxtaposing past statements with present developments. The narrative shifted decisively. This was no longer about a woman who vanished. It was about what people were willing to do to make sure she stayed gone. The phrase "family secret" stopped being metaphorical. It became an accusation. Prosecutors requested a final review of all evidence, a brutal process where every assumption was challenged and every weakness exposed. Could the defense argue alternate explanations? Could they suggest voluntary disappearance? Could they claim investigators were reading too much into normal behavior? The answers were uncomfortable but manageable. Yes, those arguments would be made. But the state's case didn't rely on one piece of evidence. It relied on the collapse of the innocent narrative under its own contradictions. One fact loomed over everything. The missing woman had left behind a life she was invested in, plans she was actively pursuing, relationships she maintained daily. There was no sign of preparation for disappearance, no financial trail, no contact, no reason to believe she chose to vanish. People don't erase themselves so completely without leaving fingerprints behind. Someone else had done that work for her. The final interviews were conducted with a sense of inevitability. Questions were sharper. Silence was allowed to stretch. When lawyers intervened, investigators noted it carefully, not as proof of guilt, but as a signal that the stakes were now fully understood. The dynamic had changed. This was no longer cooperation. It was containment. Late one evening, after hours of discussion, the decision was made. Charges would be filed. The cold case would move into the courtroom, where silence would no longer be protection and where stories would be tested under oath. No one celebrated. There was no sense of victory. Only the heavy awareness that whatever came next would alter lives permanently. As the paperwork was prepared, detectives returned one last time to the house, not officially, not as part of a search, but as a personal ritual. Standing in the quiet rooms, they felt the weight of years pressing in from every direction. This was where it had ended, and where it had been hidden, and where the truth had waited patiently for decades. The house gave nothing back, as it never had, but it didn't need to. The story no longer depended on it. By the time dawn broke, the machinery of justice was in motion. Warrants signed. Plans set. A case once written off as unsolvable now poised to redefine an entire family's history. The missing woman's name would soon return to headlines, not as a question mark, but as the center of an accusation that could no longer be ignored. And as the town prepared to wake up to news it had half expected and half dreaded, one truth became unavoidable. Closure, when it finally arrives, does not bring peace. It brings reckoning. And the reckoning for this cold case was about to begin. The arrest did not come with sirens or shouting, no dramatic chase through quiet streets, just a controlled knock, badges shown, words spoken carefully, because by then the weight of the case demanded restraint, not spectacle. When the doors opened, faces drained of color, the years collapsed in an instant, decades of practiced normalcy undone by a few sentences read from a printed page. The cold case had crossed its final threshold, and there was no stepping back. Inside the station, the atmosphere was tense but methodical. Rights were read. Questions were asked. Silence followed. One suspect stared at the table as if it might offer an escape, fingers tapping in a rhythm that betrayed nerves long held in check. Another spoke briefly, then stopped, retreating behind legal counsel, the confidence of earlier interviews replaced by something brittle and afraid. These were not strangers caught off guard. These were people confronting the moment they had imagined and dreaded for years. News spread fast. Faster than investigators expected. Faster than they could contain. By midday, the town was buzzing, social feeds flooded with disbelief, anger, grim satisfaction. Names were shared. Faces reposted alongside photos from years ago, smiling, ordinary, indistinguishable from anyone else. The shock wasn't just that arrests had been made. It was who they were. People the community thought it knew. People who had lived openly, raised families, attended events, all while carrying a secret heavy enough to crush anyone who looked at it directly. In the interrogation rooms, the strategy shifted. There was no longer a need to circle gently. The evidence was laid out cleanly, without drama. Timelines, receipts, photographs, statements placed side by side until the contradictions became unavoidable. Investigators watched closely, waiting not for tears or anger, but for the moment when the story could no longer sustain itself. One suspect tried to hold the line, repeating a version of events so worn it sounded mechanical, but the pressure was relentless. Each claim was followed by a document, each denial by a timestamp, each pause by another question. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, until it broke not with a confession, but with a sentence that changed everything. It wasn't supposed to go that far. The room went still. Detectives didn't interrupt. They didn't rush. They let the words hang there, heavy with implication. What followed was fragmented, disjointed. A narrative shaped by fear rather than clarity. An argument. A push. A fall. A moment of disbelief. The story stopped short of admitting intent. stopped short of describing what came next, but it no longer denied involvement. The wall that had stood for decades had cracked. In another room, the pressure took a different form. A family member, faced with the reality of charges and the prospect of being blamed alone, began to talk, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency. The loyalty that had once bound them together dissolved under the weight of self-preservation. Details emerged about that night that had never been spoken aloud, about decisions made in whispers, about a collective understanding that the truth could never surface. They spoke of fear, of thinking they could fix it, of believing that time would erase what had happened. They described the hours after the incident not as chaos, but as grim cooperation, a shared mission to make the problem disappear. The woman's absence had been engineered, not impulsively, but with the cold logic of people convinced they had no other option. Investigators listened, documenting everything, aware that each word carried legal consequences. They pushed gently when the story blurred, anchored statements to physical evidence, clarified timelines until the narrative solidified into something the prosecution could use. It wasn't a clean confession. It was messy, emotional, riddled with justifications and regret, but it was enough to confirm what the case had been building toward all along. The official statement came later that day, brief and carefully worded. Charges announced. Acknowledgement of the victim. Assurance that justice, though delayed, was being pursued. There were no details about remains, no definitive answers to every question the public demanded. But the message was clear. This was no longer an unsolved disappearance. The cold case was active, alive, moving toward judgment. The reaction was immediate and intense. Some in the community felt vindicated, their long-held suspicions finally validated. Others felt betrayed, struggling to reconcile the people they knew with the accusations now leveled against them. Candlelight vigils appeared alongside heated debates, grief colliding with anger in public spaces and private conversations alike. The town was forced to look at itself and ask how something so dark could exist beneath such an ordinary surface. For the family of the missing woman, the moment was unbearable in a different way. Relief and horror intertwined, the confirmation of foul play ending decades of uncertainty while opening wounds that had never healed. Knowing what happened did not bring peace. It brought images they wished they could unsee, questions they wished they hadn't asked. Closure, they realized, was a word that promised more than it could deliver. As the suspects were processed, fingerprints taken, photographs snapped, the reality of the situation settled in. These were no longer rumors or theories. They were defendants, facing the full weight of a system designed to expose truth under the harshest light. Their futures narrowed to court dates and legal strategies, their pasts about to be dissected in public, frame by frame. Late that night, investigators gathered quietly, exhaustion etched into their faces. There was no celebration, no sense of triumph, only the heavy awareness that while they had brought the case to this point, the hardest part was still ahead. Trials are unpredictable. Juries are human. Truth, even when uncovered, can still be contested. And somewhere in that uncertainty lingered one final, unresolved question, the one that haunted everyone involved. Without a body, without a final resting place, could the full story ever be told? The confessions hinted at what had happened, but not where it had ended. The woman remained physically absent, her fate described but not located, her story still missing its final chapter. As the town settled into uneasy sleep, the cold case that had defined it for decades entered a new phase, one governed by courtrooms and verdicts rather than speculation and silence. The family's secret was no longer contained. It was exposed, raw and damaging, and it would now be tested in the one place where stories are stripped of excuses. The night passed without resolution, but with a certainty that could no longer be denied. The truth had begun to surface, and no amount of time, loyalty, or fear would be able to force it back under again. The courtroom was colder than anyone expected, not just in temperature but in feeling, a sterile space where years of secrecy were reduced to exhibits and transcripts, where the weight of a vanished life was measured in words spoken under oath. When the defendants were brought in, the room shifted, a collective intake of breath as the community saw them framed not as neighbors or relatives, but as accused, their faces stripped of familiarity and replaced by the gravity of what they were facing. Opening statements avoided theatrics. Prosecutors spoke plainly, deliberately, laying out a story built not on spectacle but on accumulation, a case assembled from fragments that refused to fit any innocent explanation. They spoke of control, of silence, of a night that spiraled out of control, and a morning that began a lie so large it required decades to sustain. The defense countered with doubt, reminding the jury of what was missing, emphasizing the absence of a body, warning against conclusions drawn from circumstantial threads woven too tightly. Witnesses followed, one by one, each adding texture to a story the town thought it knew. Neighbors described odd sights and sounds, moments dismissed at the time, but now charged with meaning. Former friends spoke of tension, of arguments that hinted at deeper fractures inside the home. Investigators detailed their process, careful to explain how patience, not chance, had driven the case forward, how cold cases don't explode into truth, they erode the lies that protect it. The most difficult testimony came from within the family. Voices shook. Eyes avoided contact. Some answers were clipped and rehearsed. Others stumbled out in raw fragments, burdened by guilt and fear. One witness described the hours after the incident in halting detail, the confusion, the whispered decisions, the understanding that whatever had happened could not be undone. The courtroom listened in silence, aware that they were hearing echoes of a moment that had been locked away for a lifetime. Cross-examination was relentless. Defense attorneys pressed on inconsistencies, on memory decay, on the dangers of hindsight. They suggested alternative explanations, coincidences magnified by time, normal behavior recast as suspicious. The tension in the room grew with each challenge, the jury tasked with separating reasonable doubt from deliberate obfuscation, with deciding whether the absence of a body was an obstacle or a consequence. Forensic experts testified next, careful and precise, explaining what was found and what it meant, and just as importantly, what wasn't found and why that mattered. They spoke of cleaning agents, of altered surfaces, of changes that could only be explained by intent. They didn't claim certainty beyond the evidence. They didn't need to. The implication was enough. Something had happened in that house, and someone had worked very hard to make sure it left no trace. As days stretched into weeks, the emotional toll became visible. Jurors grew quieter. The defendants appeared smaller, the confidence they once projected replaced by strain. In the gallery, members of the community sat side by side with conflicting emotions, anger, sadness, disbelief, all coexisting uncomfortably. The missing woman's name was spoken again and again, a reminder that this wasn't an abstract legal exercise. It was about a life interrupted and erased. The prosecution's final witness was unexpected but devastating. A former confidant, someone who had lived with a secret longer than anyone realized, took the stand and spoke of a conversation years after the disappearance, a moment when fear slipped and the truth surfaced just enough to confirm what had been suspected all along. The testimony was careful, hedged, but it landed with force, tying together threads the defense had worked hard to keep separate. Closing arguments brought the case into sharp focus. The prosecution asked the jury to look not for a single piece of proof, but for the story the evidence told when viewed as a whole. They spoke of responsibility, of the cost of silence, of the impossibility of believing that an invested, connected woman would simply walk away from her life without leaving a single mark. The defense urged caution, warning against conviction based on emotion and assumption, reminding the jury that certainty must be proven, not inferred. Deliberations began in private, but the tension spilled into the hallways, into the town beyond the courthouse walls. No one spoke confidently about the outcome. Too much time had passed. Too many variables remained. Cold cases don't promise clean endings, and everyone involved knew it. The question wasn't just whether the jury would convict, but what a verdict could truly resolve after so many years. While the jury deliberated, investigators reflected on the path that had brought them here. The reopened file, the overlooked details, the slow collapse of a story that had held for decades. Whatever the outcome, the truth had been dragged into the open, and that alone felt significant. The missing woman was no longer just a name on a report. She was the center of a public reckoning. When the jury returned, the room held its breath. The verdict, when read, was measured, deliberate, the words falling heavy into the silence. Guilt on some counts, uncertainty on others. A mixed result that reflected the complexity of the case and the limitations of proof. There were no cheers, no outbursts. Just quiet reactions, tears wiped away, heads bowed. A collective understanding that justice, when delayed this long, rarely feels complete. Sentencing would come later, but the immediate impact was clear. The family's secret had been acknowledged by the system meant to confront it. The official record would no longer describe the case as unsolved. The cold case was closed in the only way it could be, not with absolute certainty, but with accountability imposed where it could be. Outside the courthouse, the town exhaled, unsure how to feel. Some called it justice. Others called it too late. Most simply felt tired, drained by a story that had haunted them for so long. The woman's absence was still real, still painful, but now it had context, a narrative that replaced the endless question mark. As night fell, the courtroom lights went dark, but the echoes of testimony lingered, settling back into the community that had carried this weight for decades. The trial was over, but its consequences were only beginning, reshaping relationships, memories, and the way the town understood its own past. And in that uneasy quiet, one truth stood out, clear and undeniable. Some secrets can be buried for years, but once unearthed, they change everything forever. The verdict did not end the story. It fractured it, sending shockwaves through a town that had waited decades for a simple answer and received something far more complicated. People stood outside the courthouse long after the doors closed, talking in low voices, replaying testimony, parsing the meaning of guilt that wasn't total and innocence that wasn't clean. The cold case was officially closed, but emotionally, it felt wide open, raw and unfinished. Sentencing loomed like a second trial, quieter but no less heavy. Victim impact statements were prepared, words chosen carefully to express years of absence without reopening wounds that had never truly healed. Family members practiced reading sentences they had rewritten dozens of times, unsure how to condense decades of loss into minutes at a podium. The woman's name, once whispered in private grief, was about to be spoken again in a room where consequences were final. In the meantime, the defendants returned to a different kind of confinement. Not just cells or legal restrictions, but isolation from a world that now saw them through a single lens. Friends disappeared. Support shrank. Ordinary routines vanished overnight. They had lived for years believing the past was sealed, that time itself had granted immunity. Now, time had become the very thing used against them. Investigators watched from a distance, their role officially complete, but their connection impossible to sever. Cold cases do that. They linger, long after files are closed and evidence is boxed away. Each detective carried pieces of the story with them, moments they replayed in quiet hours, wondering if something more could have been done, if another path might have led to a different outcome. Closure, they knew, was never absolute. Media coverage shifted again, this time toward reflection. Long-form articles dissected the case, timelines laid out with clinical precision, family dynamics analyzed by strangers who had never stepped inside the house at the center of it all. Podcasts and documentaries followed, voices narrating the story with dramatic pauses and ominous music, turning lived trauma into consumable content. The town became a backdrop, a symbol, its residents unwilling participants in a narrative that no longer belonged to them. For some, the attention felt like validation. The woman had not been forgotten. Her disappearance mattered. For others, it felt invasive, reopening scars in public, reducing complex lives to roles in a true crime script. The tension between remembrance and exploitation settled heavily, another consequence of a case that refused to stay contained. Inside the family, the verdict deepened existing fractures. Some members felt relief, a grim satisfaction that the truth, however incomplete, had been acknowledged. Others felt betrayed, convinced that the system had misunderstood, that the story presented in court was a distortion shaped by pressure and time. Conversations stopped entirely in some branches of the family tree, while in others, old alliances shifted, blame redistributed in quiet, painful ways. The missing woman's immediate relatives faced a different reckoning. With the legal process moving toward its end, they were left with a question they had avoided for years: what comes after justice? For decades, hope and anger had given structure to their grief. Now, with the case resolved on paper, there was space where purpose had been, and that emptiness was frightening. They visited her photograph, touched its edges, searching for a sense of peace that never fully arrived. Sentencing day arrived without drama. No surprises. The judge spoke deliberately, acknowledging the weight of time, the harm caused not only by the crime itself, but by the years of silence that followed. The sentences reflected compromise, accountability constrained by the limits of proof and age, punishment tempered by the reality that the defendants were no longer who they had been decades earlier. The room absorbed the words in silence. As the gavel fell, there was no release, no emotional crescendo. Just a quiet finality, the legal system moving on as it always does, leaving human consequences in its wake. The defendants were led away. Family members embraced or turned away. The missing woman's name echoed once more, then faded into procedural language and dates. Outside, life resumed awkwardly. Businesses reopened. Schools let out. The town continued, but it did so altered, carrying the knowledge that what had haunted it for years was not an unspeakable mystery, but a truth shaped by ordinary people making extraordinary choices under pressure. That realization was harder to live with than any unknown. In the months that followed, the house at the center of the case stood unchanged, a silent witness to everything that had unfolded within and around it. Some wanted it demolished, erased like the evidence once was. Others argued it should remain, a reminder, a warning. In the end, it stayed, blending back into the neighborhood, its significance visible only to those who knew where to look. Cold cases often end with answers. This one ended with understanding, a subtler and more unsettling conclusion. The woman's fate was clearer, but her absence remained absolute. No remains were recovered. No final location revealed. The physical truth of what happened to her was still missing, locked in memories that might never fully surface. And so the story settled into the town's history, not as a neat resolution, but as a cautionary tale about silence and time, about how secrets can survive for decades if enough people agree not to look too closely. The case was closed in the eyes of the law, but its shadows stretched long, touching lives that had nothing to do with that night and yet could never fully escape its impact. Long after the headlines faded and the cameras left, the question lingered, softer now but no less haunting. Not who did it or even why, but how so many years could pass with the truth hidden in plain sight. In that unanswered space, the cold case continued to live, not in files or courtrooms, but in the collective memory of a place forever changed by what it learned about itself. Time did what it always does after a verdict. It moved forward without asking permission, indifferent to the fact that an entire town was still standing in the emotional wreckage of what had been uncovered. The headlines thinned, the reporters left, and the case that once dominated every conversation slipped quietly into the background, replaced by new scandals, new tragedies, new noise. But beneath that surface calm, the aftershocks continued, subtle and persistent, reshaping lives in ways no sentence or legal closure could ever account for. For the family of the missing woman, the days stretched strangely, no longer defined by court dates or interviews, but by a silence that felt different from before. This silence wasn't uncertainty. It was finality without fulfillment. They knew now what had happened in broad strokes, but the lack of physical proof, no grave, no place to mourn, left their grief suspended, unfinished. Rituals felt hollow. Memorials felt symbolic rather than grounding. How do you say goodbye to someone whose end exists only in words? Some of them began to search on their own. Not officially, not with law enforcement's blessing, but quietly, driven by the need to locate something tangible, a location, a trace, a final answer. They revisited places mentioned in testimony, drove rural roads at dusk, stared out over fields and rivers that had long since reclaimed whatever secrets they might have once held. Each search ended the same way, with nothing but the sound of wind and the realization that time is the most effective accomplice there is. Investigators, though reassigned, felt the pull as well. Cold cases don't release their grip easily, especially ones that end without a body. In private moments, some reviewed old notes, maps, transcripts, wondering if a detail dismissed as irrelevant might now point somewhere new. They understood the reality, though. Evidence degrades. Landscapes change. Memories soften. At some point, the search stops being about discovery and becomes an act of remembrance. The defendants, now serving their sentences, faced a different kind of reckoning. Prison stripped away the layers of normalcy they had relied on for decades, leaving them alone with the consequences of choices made long ago. Some maintained their versions of events, clinging to partial admissions and careful language. Others withdrew entirely, refusing interviews, refusing contact, their silence as rigid as it had ever been. Regret, if it existed, remained private, locked behind institutional walls. Psychologists who later studied the case spoke of collective denial, of how shared secrets can become normalized within families, how the extraordinary can be reframed as necessary when fear overrides morality. It wasn't about monsters, they said. It was about people convincing themselves that survival justified everything that followed. That analysis unsettled the town more than any accusation ever had. Monsters are easy to fear. Ordinary people are not. The house became an unspoken landmark. No plaques. No markers. Just a structure people avoided looking at too closely. New residents eventually moved in, unaware at first, then informed by whispers and online searches, forced to reconcile their daily routines with a knowledge of what had once unfolded within those walls. They painted over old colors, replaced floors, filled rooms with new furniture, but the feeling lingered, intangible and impossible to fully erase. In schools, teachers noticed changes. Students asked questions. Not about the crime itself, but about how it could happen, how adults could live with something like that for so long. Lessons drifted toward ethics, responsibility, the consequences of silence. The case became a reference point, a shorthand for what happens when truth is postponed indefinitely. The town, once defined by its quiet normalcy, now carried a story that refused to stay buried. Anniversaries took on new meaning. The date of the disappearance, once marked by vigils and unanswered prayers, became a moment of reflection tinged with anger and sorrow. Attendance at memorials fluctuated, some years crowded, others sparse, as people struggled to decide how much space the past deserved in their present lives. The missing woman's photograph appeared again, older now, faded by time, yet still arresting in its simplicity. True crime interest surged and waned in cycles. Each resurgence brought renewed scrutiny, armchair theories, speculative maps posted online by people thousands of miles away. Some claimed to know where the remains were. Others accused investigators of missing obvious clues. The family learned to ignore it, or tried to, understanding that curiosity without consequence is easy, and that for outsiders, the story was entertainment, not lived reality. Behind closed doors, conversations continued about the one thing the case never delivered: location. What had been done with her? Whether anyone still alive knew, and was choosing silence over relief. Plea deals had not required full disclosure. The law had taken what it could prove and left the rest untouched. Justice, it turned out, was not designed to answer every question. And yet, something had changed fundamentally. The fear that once kept people quiet was gone. The secret was no longer shared. It had been exposed, dissected, named. Even without every detail, the truth had shifted from rumor to record. That mattered, even if it didn't heal. Late at night, when the town was quiet again, the kind of quiet it had been before everything came undone, people still thought about that night decades ago, about how ordinary it must have seemed until it wasn't. They wondered how many other stories like this existed, hidden behind closed doors, protected by time and trust. The cold case had closed, but it had opened something else, a collective awareness that safety and certainty are often illusions. And somewhere in that awareness, the missing woman remained present, not as a mystery anymore, but as a reminder of what silence costs, of how long the past can wait, and of how even when the law draws a line and calls at the end, the human story continues, unresolved, echoing forward into years that were never supposed to carry its weight. Years began to stack on top of one another again, but this time they carried a different weight, not the uncertainty of not knowing, but the unease of knowing enough to be disturbed and not enough to be satisfied. The case slipped into the category people call resolved, yet it never behaved like one. It resurfaced in conversations when least expected, in quiet moments when the mind wandered back to that night and tried, once again, to fill in the gaps no one ever closed. The missing woman's name became a reference point, a before and after marker in the town's collective memory. People measured time against it, how old they had been when she vanished, how much their lives had changed since. Newcomers learned the story gradually, not from headlines but from hushed explanations, the way uncomfortable truths are passed down when they can't be erased. "That's the house," someone would say, lowering their voice, even decades later. Law enforcement agencies occasionally revisited the file, not officially reopening it, but reviewing it with fresh eyes whenever new technology or methodology emerged. Ground-penetrating radar was discussed, then dismissed. Aerial surveys considered, then ruled out. Too much time. Too many variables. Landscapes altered beyond recognition. The probability of discovery shrank with each passing year, but the impulse to try never fully disappeared. One retired investigator admitted privately that the lack of remains haunted him more than any other aspect of the case. Without them, there was no finality, no place to point and say this is where it ended. He described it as a sentence that never finished, a story cut off mid-word. Even after convictions, even after public acknowledgement, the absence of a physical ending left something unresolved at the core of the narrative. The family continued to live in the aftermath, navigating holidays and milestones without the person who should have been there. Weddings felt incomplete. Birthdays carried an edge of sadness. Children grew up knowing their story through fragments, learning early that some questions don't have answers, and some answers don't bring comfort. They inherited not just grief, but the responsibility of remembering. Occasionally, someone would come forward claiming new information. A deathbed confession. A drunken remark overheard years earlier. An anonymous letter sent to a newsroom. Each tip was evaluated, each lead pursued just enough to confirm what investigators already suspected. Most ended in disappointment, reminders that hope can be cruel when it has nothing solid to attach itself to. True crime culture continued to orbit the case, reframing it again and again through different lenses. Some saw it as a story about justice delayed. Others focused on family psychology, on how loyalty can mutate into complicity. A few tried to turn it into a puzzle, mapping timelines and locations, as if enough lines drawn on a map could conjure the missing final piece. The family watched from a distance, detached and weary, knowing that no theory would ever change what they had lost. The defendants aged behind bars or under supervision, their names occasionally appearing in updates few people read. Time, which had once protected them, now moved slowly and relentlessly in the opposite direction. Appeals were filed and denied. Statements were made and retracted. None included the one detail everyone still wanted. Silence, it seemed, was the last thing they were determined to keep. In the town, the story became a quiet lesson passed down rather than a headline revisited. Parents warn children about secrets, about the danger of assuming you know what happens inside someone else's home. Teachers reference the case indirectly, emphasizing critical thinking, the importance of speaking up, the cost of looking away. The disappearance was no longer just a crime. It was a cautionary tale woven into the town's identity. Every so often, someone would ask the question aloud, usually late at night or after a few drinks, the question no one ever answered the same way. Do you think they'll ever find her? The responses varied, from cautious optimism to resigned disbelief, but underneath them all was the same understanding. Even if they did, even if a location was revealed or remains recovered, it would not rewrite the past. It would only add punctuation to a sentence already heavy with meaning. The cold case, though labeled closed, continued to live in limbo, occupying a space between resolution and mystery. It stood as proof that the legal system and the human need for answers do not always align. Justice can be served without truth being complete. Accountability can exist alongside silence. Those contradictions became part of the story, as integral as the crime itself. On quiet evenings, when the streets emptied and the town settled into the familiar rhythm of small, ordinary lives, people still thought about that night, about the choices made in a matter of hours that reshaped decades. They wondered what they would have done, how fear might have guided their own decisions, whether they too could have chosen silence under the right circumstances. The questions were uncomfortable, and they lingered. And in that lingering discomfort, the missing woman remained present, not as a face on a missing poster or a name in a court transcript, but as a constant reminder that some truths are partial by nature, that some endings are never clean. The cold case had been closed by law, but by memory, by conscience, by the quiet spaces where unanswered questions live, it was still very much alive, waiting for a final word that might never come. The final stage of the story arrived without ceremony, the way exhaustion does, creeping in after the adrenaline fades, after the arguments have been made and the judgments handed down. There was no announcement that this was the end, no clear line where the case stopped mattering and life resumed its normal shape. Instead, it dissolved slowly into the background, becoming part of the town's atmosphere. Something felt rather than spoken. The missing woman's belongings were sorted through years after the trial, not as evidence, but as memory. Boxes opened in quiet rooms. Clothing folded carefully, as if she might still need it. Letters reread, their tone scrutinized for hidden meaning that might never have been there. Each object carried the weight of two stories, the life she lived, and the one that was taken from her. Nothing in those boxes explained how it ended. They only confirmed how real she had been. The legal record, now finalized, sat in archives and databases, referenced occasionally by students, journalists, and professionals studying cold cases. On paper, it was a success story. A decades-old disappearance resolved. Accountability established. But the neatness of the summary never matched the reality it described. There were too many footnotes, too many unanswered questions buried beneath the official conclusion. Some nights, people still dreamed about the case, about alternative outcomes, about moments where a single different choice could have changed everything. Dreams of hearing something through a wall, of saying something sooner, of asking one more question. Guilt by proximity haunted those who had lived nearby, who had known the family, who wondered if they had ignored signs because acknowledging them would have been inconvenient. The house, still standing, became an object of quiet debate once more. Developers showed interest. Preservationists argued against erasure. In the end, nothing happened. It remained what it had always been, a private residence with a public shadow, its significance invisible unless you knew where to look. Children rode bikes past it without knowing why adults sometimes glanced away. The family, fractured beyond repair, learned to exist in parallel lives. Some moved away, seeking anonymity in places where their last name meant nothing. Others stayed, rooted by history or obligation, carrying the burden openly. Reunions never happened. Apologies were never exchanged. Time did not heal these wounds. It merely made them less visible. Occasionally, someone involved in the case would speak publicly, usually in response to renewed interest from a documentary or podcast. Their words were careful, restrained, shaped by years of reflection. They spoke of lessons learned, of the importance of revisiting old cases, of listening when stories don't quite make sense. They did not speculate about what they could not prove. They did not offer comfort they could not honestly provide. The missing woman's name continued to appear in unexpected places. A scholarship established in her honor. A park bench engraved quietly, without fanfare. A mention in a local history book that treated her disappearance as a turning point rather than an anomaly. These gestures were small, imperfect, but they kept her from fading into abstraction. What lingered most was the understanding that the truth had not arrived all at once, but in fragments, over years, through patience and persistence rather than luck. The case changed how people thought about time. Not as something that heals by default, but as something that tests how long a lie can survive before it collapses under its own weight. In private moments, investigators admitted that part of them still hoped for one last answer. A letter, a map, a moment of conscience from someone who had stayed silent. Hope didn't make sense anymore, but it persisted anyway, quiet and stubborn. Because once you spend decades chasing a story, letting go of the final page feels like giving up on the person at its center. The town learned to live with that incompleteness. It became part of its character, a reminder etched into memory rather than stone. People spoke more openly about doubt, about the limits of certainty, about the cost of believing that time alone can solve what fear creates. The case became a mirror, reflecting uncomfortable truths about loyalty, denial, and the ease with which silence can be justified. As years passed, the cold case stopped being a headline and started being a reference, invoked when something didn't feel right, when explanations came too easily, when absence was treated as proof of nothing rather than evidence of something hidden. In that way, it continued to do work long after the courts were done with it. And somewhere in that ongoing ripple, the missing woman remained present, not as a victim frozen in the past, but as a force shaping conversations, decisions, and awareness. Her story no longer asked to be solved. It asked to be remembered accurately, without simplification, without comfort. The end, when it finally came, was not a moment but a condition. Acceptance without satisfaction. Knowledge without peace. A truth that arrived too late to save anything, but not too late to matter. The cold case was closed, yes, but its legacy stayed open, unfolding quietly in the lives it touched. A reminder that some stories don't end so much as they fade into us, becoming part of how we understand the darkness that can exist behind the most ordinary doors. The last echoes of the case did not come from a courtroom or a headline, but from quieter places, from moments when nothing else was happening and the mind drifted back to what had been learned and what had not. That was how this story ended, not with a revelation, but with a presence that refused to leave, a reminder that some truths don't conclude, they settle in and change the shape of everything around them. In the years that followed, the town stopped waiting for more. No new tips.
No sudden confessions.
The silence that remained was different from the one that had protected the secret for so long. This silence was empty, exhausted. It no longer held power, only residue. People learned to recognize it for what it was, the sound of a story that had given everything it was ever going to give. The missing woman's photograph still existed, framed in homes and offices, printed in programs and archives, her eyes fixed on a future she never reached. She became younger as time moved forward, frozen at the age she disappeared, while everyone else aged around her. That contrast never stopped being unsettling. It reminded people that the past is not behind us in the way we like to believe. Sometimes it stays exactly where it is, waiting. Children who had not yet been born when she vanished grew up knowing her name. They learned it not as a warning but as a fact, something that belonged to their town the way streets and buildings did. They asked fewer questions than the generation before them. Maybe because they had grown up with the answer already shaped, imperfect but real. Maybe because they understood intuitively that some things don't resolve cleanly, no matter how long you wait. For the family, life continued in fragments. Some days felt almost normal. Others collapsed under the weight of memory. They learned which questions to avoid at gatherings, which anniversaries to acknowledge quietly, which to let pass. Grief, once loud and consuming, became something more subtle, a constant companion rather than an event. It didn't disappear. It adapted. The defendants faded from public view, becoming names in records rather than faces in news stories. Time reduced them the way it reduces everyone, stripping away urgency, leaving only consequence. Whether they spoke the full truth to themselves in the end was something no one else would ever know. That knowledge, if it existed, stayed locked inside them, inaccessible, irrelevant to the world that had already moved on. Law enforcement eventually closed the file for the last time. Not symbolically. Literally. Boxes labeled, shelves cleared, digital records archived. The case no longer appeared on active lists. New investigators learned about it as history, not as responsibility. And yet, among those who had worked it, the case remained alive in memory, resurfacing in other investigations, other interviews, other moments when a story didn't quite make sense. They recognized the pattern now. The calm scene. The missing chaos. The too perfect explanation. The years of silence mistaken for innocence. This case had taught them how absence can be a form of evidence, how time can protect lies as easily as it exposes them. That lesson traveled with them, influencing decisions that would never be traced back to this one story, but were shaped by it nonetheless. The house eventually changed hands again. New owners, new paint, new life. Laughter returned to the rooms. Music played. Furniture moved. The past did not stop that from happening, nor should it have. Places are not guilty. They are only containers. Still, there were moments, usually at night, when the house felt heavier, as if it remembered something the world was trying to forget. Or maybe that was just the imagination of those who knew its history too well. Every so often, someone would stand outside and look at it longer than necessary, replaying what they knew, what they suspected, what they wished had been different. Then they would move on because standing still never changed anything, and this story had proven that waiting was not the same as action. The cold case entered textbooks, training seminars, conferences. It became an example cited not for its drama, but for its patience. For the way it demonstrated that time does not erase facts, it only buries them, and that burial is rarely permanent. It was used to teach others how to listen differently, how to question narratives that seem too stable, how to recognize when a story has been rehearsed rather than remembered. And through all of that, the woman at the center of it remained exactly who she had always been. Not a symbol, not a lesson, a person. Someone who had plans, habits, frustrations, joys. Someone whose life did not exist to serve as a case study or a warning. Someone who was loved, and whose absence created a void no amount of explanation could ever fill. That is the part that never changed, no matter how many years passed or how many conclusions were drawn. The truth of what happened mattered, but it did not replace what was lost. It did not restore what had been taken. It only named it. In the end, that may be the most honest conclusion this story could offer. Not justice as a clean victory. Not closure as peace. But acknowledgement. The refusal to let silence win. The insistence that even when answers are incomplete, they are better than the void. The Illinois cold case was finally closed, yes. The records say so. The courts agree. The headlines have moved on. But the story it told did not end. It folded itself into the lives it touched, into the town that carried it, into the understanding that some secrets survive not because they are clever, but because people are afraid of what will happen if they are told. And now, long after the last verdict and the last article, that fear has lost its hold. The secret has been exposed, stripped of its protection, left to stand in the open where it belongs. What remains is not mystery but memory. A life interrupted. A truth delayed. A silence broken too late to save anything, but not too late to matter. That is where this story rests. Not resolved, not forgotten, just finally, undeniably known. The story did not truly stop there because stories like this never do. They only sink deeper, embedding themselves into the spaces between people, into the way questions are asked and answers are weighed. Even after everything had been said, after every conclusion had been stamped and archived, there remained a faint pressure, a sense that the truth, though exposed, had not finished moving. Part of that came from the absence itself, the physical gap left behind by a woman who never returned, never aged, never got the chance to contradict the versions of her life others told for her. Without a body, without a final place to stand and say this is where it ended, her existence hovered in a strange state, neither fully present nor entirely gone. She was spoken about in the past tense, yet remembered in the present, a contradiction no verdict could resolve. In quiet moments, people still imagined her, not as a victim, but as she had been before everything fractured. Walking through town, standing in line at a store, arguing about something small and forgettable. Those ordinary images became more powerful than any courtroom testimony because they reminded everyone of what was stolen, not just a life, but a future that had unfolded everywhere except where it belonged. The town changed subtly because of that awareness. People noticed silences differently. They listened longer. When a story didn't quite align, when an explanation felt too smooth, too rehearsed, they hesitated instead of nodding along. The cold case left behind a kind of instinct, a communal skepticism shaped not by paranoia, but by experience. Trust was no longer automatic. It was earned. You could see it in the way neighbors interacted, in the way questions were asked when something seemed off. Not accusatory, just attentive. As if the town had learned, collectively and painfully, that ignoring discomfort doesn't make it disappear, it only gives it time to grow. The missing woman's family carried that lesson most heavily. Their grief evolved again, no longer driven by uncertainty or pursuit, but by integration. They learned how to carry her absence without letting it define every interaction, how to speak her name without bracing for collapse. Some days were lighter, others were not. There was no pattern, no timeline, just adaptation. They discovered that closure is not a door you walk through, but a landscape you learn to navigate. Some parts are familiar. Others catch you off guard. The case may have ended, but their relationship with it did not. It simply became quieter, more internal, less shaped by external forces. Occasionally, they were asked if they wanted more. Another investigation. Another search. Another attempt to locate what had never been found. The answer was never simple. Wanting answers and surviving without them turned out to be two different skills, and mastering one did not mean abandoning the other. They lived in that tension, choosing peace where they could and persistence where it still felt necessary. For investigators who had worked the case, the finality was professional, not personal. They moved on to other files, other crimes, other stories waiting to be uncovered. But this one stayed with them, resurfacing when a scene felt too controlled, when a timeline felt too neat, when a disappearance lacked chaos. It sharpened their instincts, altered their patience, reminded them that time is not neutral, it can be manipulated. They spoke about the case to younger officers, not as a triumph, but as a warning. About assumptions, about proximity, about how the truth is often hidden not by strangers, but by familiarity. The Illinois cold case became a quiet benchmark, a reference point whispered during training and late-night debriefs, its lessons carried forward into cases that would never know its name. Beyond the town, beyond the family, the story continued to ripple outward in unexpected ways. It influenced legislation discussions about cold case funding. It appeared in academic journals examining delayed justice. It was cited in debates about plea deals and the limits of accountability when time erodes evidence. The woman at its center became part of systems and structures she never chose to enter, her life intersecting with policy and theory long after it ended. And yet, for all that reach, the heart of the story remained small and personal. A night, a house, a decision. Everything that followed radiated outward from that single point, expanding across decades, across lives, across institutions, but always anchored to the same moment where silence began. That silence, once powerful, now felt exposed. It no longer frightened people the way it once had. It had been named, confronted, stripped of its authority. What remained was quieter, less threatening, but still present, a reminder of what happens when fear is allowed to guide choice. Sometimes, late at night, when the town settled into stillness, people thought about how close the truth had been to the surface all along. How many times it had almost emerged. How many opportunities had passed without action. Those thoughts were not accusatory. They were reflective. Regret without direction has a way of becoming philosophy. The cold case taught them that evil doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always leave obvious scars. Sometimes it wears routine. Sometimes it survives because it blends in. That understanding lingered, uncomfortable but necessary, reshaping how people defined danger and safety. As years continued to pass, the story softened around the edges. The sharpest details blurred, replaced by broader meaning. New generations learned it not as a scandal, but as history. The emotional charge dulled, but the lesson remained intact. Silence protects harm. Time does not absolve it. Truth delayed is still truth. And in that final understanding, the woman's presence endured. Not frozen, not mythologized, simply remembered. She became part of the town's internal compass, a reference point for empathy, for vigilance, for the cost of looking away. Her story did not end with a verdict or a sentence. It ended, if it ended at all, in awareness. This was the last chapter not because nothing followed, but because everything that followed belonged to those who lived with it. The cold case had given what it could. It had exposed what was hidden. It had named what had been avoided. The rest was human work, slow and imperfect, carried out quietly over years. And so the story settles here, not with certainty, not with comfort, but with clarity. A life was taken. A truth was buried. Time passed. The truth returned. Not whole, not complete, but enough. Enough to say the silence did not win. Enough to say she mattered. Enough to say that even after decades, even after fear and denial and delay, the truth can still surface, and when it does, it leaves behind something stronger than closure. It leaves behind memory. And memory, unlike silence, does not disappear. The final movement of the story was never meant to be spoken aloud, because by the time it arrived, there was nothing left to announce. No new evidence. No last confession. No late discovery rising from the ground to complete the picture. What remained was quieter than all of that, a slow settling, the way dust falls after a long disturbance, revealing what had always been underneath. People began to realize that the case had changed them in ways they couldn't easily name. Not dramatically, not all at once, but subtly, permanently. The way they listened when someone hesitated before answering. The way they noticed when explanations arrived too quickly. The way absence itself became something to pay attention to, not as emptiness, but as information. The woman's story stopped being retold in full. Instead, fragments surfaced in conversation, references without explanation, shorthand understood only by those who knew. Her name carried meaning beyond the facts of her disappearance. It became a symbol not of mystery, but of consequence. A reminder that actions echo far longer than intentions, and that silence, once chosen, rarely stays contained. In private, some people admitted what they had never said before. Not confessions, not admissions of guilt, but acknowledgments. That something had felt wrong even back then. That they had wondered, briefly, before convincing themselves they were overthinking it. That they had chosen comfort over curiosity. These realizations arrived too late to change the past, but not too late to change how they saw themselves within it. The town did not memorialize the case with monuments or ceremonies. It did something quieter. It remembered. It told the story without embellishment. It resisted turning it into legend. It allowed it to remain uncomfortable, unresolved in places, because smoothing it over would have felt like another form of erasure. The missing woman was no longer